Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive with us. This time, we're going to be looking at 15 upcoming early access RPGs for 2025. We've got all this information from a recent video we watched, and we figured we'd break it down for you guys, give you the details of what makes each of these games special, why the developers are going with early access, and how long they're planning on staying in early access. So we jump right into it. I think first on the list, we've got Hyper Light Breaker. Now, this one immediately caught my eye because it's not just an RPG.
Right. It's a very interesting blend of genres.
Exactly.
I think they're calling it an open world roguelite with procedurally generated worlds. But it's got elements of platforming, shooter, and even fighting games in there.
Yeah, kind of like a little something for everyone, it seems like.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
So they're going with early access because it sounds like they're basically pioneering a new subgenre.
Yeah.
And they want to get community feedback as they develop it.
Yeah, which makes a lot of sense.
Right. I mean, with something this ambitious and unique, it's like you really need that player input to shape it. So they're aiming for about a year in early access, but they're also saying that they're flexible depending on how things go and what the feedback is like.
Makes sense. Yeah, a lot of these developers are taking that approach, emphasizing that they're really open to adjusting their plans based on what they hear from the players.
Yeah, it's becoming less about like a rigid timeline and more about this open dialogue with the community, which is pretty cool, I think. Next up is Voyagers of Nera. Now, this is an action RPG that just looks gorgeous. The art style is amazing, very vibrant, and full of life.
It's got that classic adventure feel to it.
Totally. And their reason for going with early access is very similar. They want to fine-tune the gameplay with the help of their community. So they're also looking at about a year in early access. But again, that's not set in stone.
Right. It's all about that flexibility.
Exactly. Okay, get ready for a blast from the past because Heroes of Might and Magic is back. Heroes of Might and Magic. Olden Era, to be exact.
A classic strategy RPG gets a fresh coat of paint.
Yeah, they're basically reviving this beloved franchise, bringing it to a new audience.
Yeah.
And their focus with early access is to really polish the game's technical aspects and also fine-tune the mechanics based on, you guessed it, community feedback.
It sounds like they're really committed to honoring the legacy of the franchise while also making sure it feels modern and engaging.
Yeah, I think that's a really smart approach, especially with a game that has such a dedicated fan base. Next up is the Quinfall. This is a massively multiplayer RPG, and they're taking a slightly different approach with early access. Instead of focusing primarily on core mechanics, they're actually using it to expand the game's content and refine existing features. It's like they've got the foundation solid, and now they're building upon it with the help of the community.
Right, so they're not necessarily overhauling the core gameplay. It's more about adding depth and richness to the world.
Yeah, exactly. It's a different kind of early access focus, which is interesting. They're planning on being in early access for about 6 months. But again, that could change depending on feedback and development progress.
It seems like a lot of these developers are taking that approach, which is good. It shows a willingness to adapt and be responsive to the community.
Okay, survival game fans, listen up. BLACKFROST: The Long Dark 2 is hitting early access.
Oh, wow, that's exciting.
Right. Big news. The developers, Hinterland Studio, they're actually pioneers of the early access model. They used it really successfully with the original The Long Dark. And they're aiming for at least a year, maybe even 2, in early access for the sequel.
That's a pretty substantial commitment.
Yeah, it is. But what's even cooler is that they've said they're committed to continuing to update the game even after it leaves early access.
Oh, wow, that's great to hear.
Yeah, they're really dedicated to this project and to their community. Lunavania is next. Another action RPG that's generating a lot of buzz. It's got this beautiful art style that people are really drawn to. And they're planning for a 2-year early access period.
2 years? Wow, that's definitely on the longer end of the spectrum.
Yeah, it is. But they've said that they're open to extending it even further if needed, to make sure they really get it right.
It shows a real dedication to quality.
Definitely. Let's talk about racing games now. Tokyo Xtreme Racer is making a comeback after 18 years. Can you believe it? 18 years.
That's a long time.
They're going with early access for about 4 months, mainly to fine-tune the gameplay and make sure it lives up to the legacy of the franchise.
Yeah, they've got a lot to live up to.
They do. But they're specifically asking for feedback from both longtime fans and newcomers, which I think is a really smart way to bridge that gap and make sure the game appeals to a wide audience.
Yeah, you don't want to alienate the core fan base, but you also want to attract new players.
Exactly. Airborne Empire is next. And this is a game that's all about community-based development.
Oh.
They've had a lot of success with this approach in their previous titles. So they're going with early access for at least a year, maybe longer.
They're really embracing that collaborative approach.
Yeah, it's like they're building the game with the players, not just for them.
Right. It's a really cool philosophy.
Up next, we've got Final Night. This is an action RPG with a fighting game twist. And their reason for choosing early access is pretty straightforward. They just want to create the game alongside their players.
It seems to be a common thread here, this desire to involve the community in the development process.
Definitely. They're aiming for somewhere between 6 months and a year in early access. But they've emphasized that that end date is very flexible.
Again, flexibility seems to be the name of the game with a lot of these titles.
Okay, get ready to explore, because Sailing Alone, Aftermath, is coming to early access. This is an open-world RPG that's all about exploration. And their hook is that they're using early access to gather feedback on the game's massive, procedurally generated map. So imagine an entire world shaped by player input.
That's a really ambitious concept.
It is. They're looking at least 6 months in early access, which makes sense given the scale of what they're trying to do.
Yeah, you need time to process all that feedback and implement the necessary changes.
All right, let's lighten things up a bit with Just Move, Clean City, Messy Battle.
Yeah, you heard that right. It's a city cleaning simulation with battles.
That's a pretty unique combination. Right. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it. They're aiming for at least 2 months in early access, focusing on polishing existing features and adding new content based on feedback.
It sounds like a very focused and efficient approach.
Yeah, they're really targeting those key areas where they want community input. Ancient Kingdoms is up next. This is an indie RPG that's all about classic dungeon crawling and exploration. They're going with early access to refine the game's high-end dungeons and make sure they're challenging, but also fair and rewarding.
It's all about striking that balance.
Right, you don't want to make it too easy or too frustrating. So they're planning for a year in early access to get that just right. Get ready for One Room Dungeon. Now, the name pretty much says it all. It's an RPG where everything takes place in a single room.
Wow, that's interesting.
Yeah, very unique concept. The developer is actually a solo dev, and he's using early access to get help with balancing and polishing the game.
It's amazing how early access empowers solo developers like that.
Totally. It gives them a platform to connect with a community and get that crucial feedback. He's aiming for about 3 months in early access, which seems like a reasonable time frame for a game of this scope.
Yeah, it's all about fine-tuning those core mechanics and ensuring a smooth player experience.
Demon's Regalia Colosseum is next. This is an RPG that throws you into a brutal arena of combat. And the developer has been very upfront about their reasons for early access, saying the game is undercooked even for early access standards.
Oh, wow, that's pretty honest.
Right, but I think that kind of transparency is really refreshing. They're anticipating a long early access period, somewhere between 1 to 3 years.
That's a pretty significant range.
Yeah, it is. But it shows that they're committed to getting it right, even if it takes a while.
That's reassuring for players.
Totally. And last but not least, we have PESI's post-apocalyptic courier service, co-op delivery simulator. That's quite a mouthful.
It does roll off the tongue, doesn't it?
So this is a game all about teamwork and survival in a post-apocalyptic world. They're going with early access to shape the game alongside their community, making sure the features they implement really align with what players want.
It's all about that collaboration.
Yeah, working together to create something special. They're estimating 18 to 24 months in early access, which gives them plenty of time to experiment and refine based on feedback.
Seems like a solid plan.
Yeah, I think so. So there you have it, folks. 15 upcoming early access RPGs to keep an eye on in 2025. So thank you for joining us on this exploration.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon. But until then, keep exploring, keep playing, and most importantly, keep those conversations going.